I never imagined that one day I would be here, telling something like this. My name is Morris. I'm 42 years old, and I've always been a practical man. I work as a construction supervisor in Ottawa. I lead an ordinary life, without any major twists. I pay my bills, go out drinking with friends from time to time, and follow my routine without thinking much about what exists beyond what I can see and touch. I believe in God, but in a superficial, almost automatic way. I was never one to ponder the destiny of humanity, prophecies, or life after death. That was for fanatics, or at least, that's what I thought. But then that day came, February 14th, 2025. A cold day, yet with an open sky, like so many other Canadian winters. I was at the construction site, supervising the work when everything happened. A metallic crash cut through the air. I looked up and saw it, a huge beam of steel falling from a crane. Time seemed to slow down, but not enough to give me a chance to escape. It was quick. The impact hit me like thunder, and then silence. There was no pain, there was no sound, only an absolute void, as if the whole world had been suddenly switched off. I can't explain exactly what happened in the following seconds. I was sure I should be dead, but somehow I was still there. Not in my body, that I realized immediately, but standing, looking down. What I saw shocked me. My own body crushed beneath the steel beam, blood dripping onto the concrete, and my co-workers in panic, screaming for help. I saw everything, heard everything, yet nothing seemed real. It was like watching a movie, only I was both the protagonist and a helpless spectator. I tried to speak, tried to shout that I was okay, but no sound came out. My lips didn't even move. That's when I realized I was no longer in that world in the way I knew. Amid that chaotic scene, one thing caught my attention. Time itself seemed strange. Movements were slow, as if everything were happening underwater. But I felt light, free, without any pain. There was a strange silence around me, as if an invisible cloak isolated me from the deafening noise of the construction site. The despair of my colleagues seemed distant, as if it were happening miles away. And even though I saw my lifeless body on the ground, I felt no fear, no anguish, no despair. On the contrary, an inexplicable peace took over me. But that peace didn't last long, because suddenly something changed. The air around me began to glow, as if an invisible light were about to manifest. And then, I felt it. I didn't see anything yet, but I felt I wasn't alone. The presence was strong, but not oppressive. It was as if something, or someone, was there with me, but without revealing itself completely. The air around me seemed to vibrate with an indescribable energy, as if the very atmosphere were alive. I saw nothing beyond the scene of the construction site below me, but my body, or whatever I was at that moment, knew that something was about to happen. Then the light began to emerge. At first, they were just small golden points floating in the air, like embers suspended in space, but in seconds, these points merged, forming an intense glow, an almost tangible presence. It wasn't an ordinary light. It didn't blind. It didn't burn. On the contrary, it enveloped everything with a soft, welcoming warmth. And then, from the midst of that light, a voice called my name. Morris. It was just that, but it was enough for every fiber of my being to tremble. That voice was not just sound. It was power. It was truth. It was something I felt inside me, as if it had been sculpted into the very essence of my existence. It wasn't threatening nor severe, but it carried an authority that was impossible to ignore. I knew, in a way that went beyond human understanding, that that voice was not from an ordinary person. And when I tried to respond, I realized something even stranger. I didn't have a mouth, or rather, I didn't need one. My words were formed directly in my consciousness, as if the very act of thinking was communication enough. "Who's there?" I asked, or thought, or felt. The answer came immediately, but it wasn't merely spoken. It was placed inside me, in an indescribable way. I am. Those two words, I am, were not just a reply. They carried a weight that struck me like a wave of pure truth. It was as if, in that moment, every doubt, every skepticism, every human concept of the divine dissolved before something infinitely greater. I knew without a shadow of a doubt who was before me. Not because someone told me, but because my being recognized it. It was like remembering something that had always been there, but that I had never perceived. It was Jesus, but not as in the paintings, not like the generic image of a man in a white robe that I had seen in stained glass or old illustrations. He was presence. He was essence. He was something my human mind could barely process. And then, he emerged from the light. Not in the way a man steps out of the shadows, but as if he had always been there and now simply allowed me to see him. His face wasn't what I expected. There wasn't a specific feature I could describe, not like the exact color of the eyes or the shape of the nose, because he was beyond any physical trait. Yet, at the same time, it was the most familiar face I had ever seen. As if he carried within himself all the faces of humanity, and, at the same time, none at all. His presence wasn't overwhelming in a fearful sense, but in an absolute reverence. It was like standing before the mightiest power in the universe and, at the same time, feeling embraced like a child in the Father's arms. He looked at me, or perhaps he looked through me, and in that instant, I knew. I wasn't dead. I was where I was meant to be. For a moment, everything around me disappeared. The construction site, the shouts of my colleagues, even the memory of my own body crushed under the steel beam. None of it mattered anymore. It was as if the only true reality was the one in which I now existed. And before him, every question I might have had simply dissolved. Not because they ceased to exist, but because somehow I already knew the answers, even without him needing to say them. However, Jesus spoke, and when he spoke, it wasn't just sound. His voice had texture, it had weight, it had something that penetrated directly into my soul. Morris, you need to see. It wasn't an order, nor a request. It was a fact, something that had been decided even before I understood what would happen next. Before I could react, the environment around me changed. There was no transition, no displacement. In an instant, I was there, before him. In the next, I was somewhere else. The light around me expanded, and when it dissipated, I found myself flying over a city. But it wasn't Ottawa. I recognized the skyscrapers, the busy streets, the urban hustle. It was Toronto, but something was different. There was a metallic shine on the structures, an almost artificial organization in the streets, as if everything had been remade, redesigned to fit into something larger. At first it seemed like mere modernity, but then I realized this city was not only advanced, it was controlled. At first it seemed like the future. Everything was clean, immaculate, without signs of disorder or decay. The streets were full of people, but there was something odd about them. No one seemed to be in a hurry. No one seemed distracted or even hesitant. Everyone walked with an almost rehearsed purpose, as if they knew exactly where to go, without deviations, without doubts. There were no animated conversations, no natural buzz of a big city. Everything was meticulously ordered, and instead of a sense of progress, what I felt was a chill in my soul. I looked at the people more closely and noticed something that made my stomach churn. In their right hands, beneath the skin, there was a small glow, as if something metallic had been implanted there. And then I understood. It was the chip. Small, discreet, but present in everyone. Men, women, children. They walked the streets, entered buildings, paid for their purchases effortlessly. No wallet, no card, nothing physical. Just a gesture of the hand, and the doors opened, the credits were transferred. The machines recognized them. It all seemed convenient, perfect almost too much. But there was something more, an emptiness. I looked into the eyes of some people passing by and saw the same thing in all of them. Absence. It wasn't tiredness, it wasn't apathy. It was as if something inside them had been switched off. As if, behind that impeccable order, there was something deeply wrong. They smiled, yes, but the smile didn't reach their eyes. My heart began to race, but not from fear. It was an instinct, an overwhelming certainty that what I was seeing was not just any vision. It was a warning, an alert. I continued watching and soon noticed something even more disturbing. Among those people, there were some who seemed different. They walked more slowly, hesitated before entering places, looked around as if they were always on alert. But what caught my attention the most was that they did not have that metallic glow on their hand. They were the disconnected. And even without anyone saying anything, I knew they were a minority, an exception. And then it happened. A woman, carrying a small package in her arms, hesitated at the entrance of a commercial building. She touched the automatic door, but nothing happened. She tried again, pressing the palm of her hand against the digital reader, but the door remained closed. The people around began to notice. At first, just glances, then whispers, and then a man approached, wearing a dark uniform with a symbol I didn't recognize, but that somehow made me feel a weight in my chest. He didn't need to say anything. The woman took a step back, clutching the package tighter, and I saw the despair in her eyes. But it wasn't the despair of someone afraid of being arrested or punished. It was the despair of someone who knew they no longer belonged to that world. The woman tried to discreetly move away, but it was too late. The uniformed man raised his hand, and instantly, a second agent appeared. They didn't shout, didn't pull out weapons, didn't make a scene. They simply surrounded her, as if handling something inevitable, a routine procedure, and that scared me more than anything. There was no aggression, there was no brutality, but there was also no empathy, no emotion. They simply took her by the arms and led her away from the entrance, while the other passers-by averted their eyes as if nothing were happening, as if that were normal. And then, as if a veil had been torn away, I saw that it was happening all over the city. It wasn't an isolated case. On every street, on every corner, someone was being removed, taken to unmarked black vehicles, disappearing without resistance. And the others? They continued with their lives, as if they hadn't seen anything. There was no panic, no questioning, only acceptance, the perfect city, the perfect system, and those who didn't fit in disappeared. My blood ran cold, because at that moment, I understood what Jesus wanted to show me. This wasn't fiction. This wasn't a vague warning about a distant future. This was already happening. I wanted to shout, I wanted to run to those people and warn them, to say that this wasn't right, that there was something terribly wrong with all of it. But I couldn't. I wasn't there physically. I was merely observing, as if I were a ghost. I turned to Jesus, seeking answers, but he only looked at the city, with an expression that wasn't of anger nor of sadness. It was something beyond, something impossible to describe in human words. He knew, he always knew, but at that moment, the weight of it all fell upon me like an avalanche. The world had been deceived. And then, Jesus spoke again. Control did not come by force, but by convenience. Those words hit me like a punch. I looked at the city again, at the lifeless faces, at the disappeared whom no one mourned, and everything made sense. They weren't forced. There was no violence, no dictator imposing order with an iron fist. Instead, the system was offered as something good, as progress, as security. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, people relinquished their freedom without even noticing. The enemy didn't need to fight. He only needed to offer the easiest path. My chest felt heavy. I wanted to believe that this was just an exaggerated vision, a symbolic warning, but I knew it wasn't. This was happening. Not like some crazy conspiracy theory, not like a dystopian movie plot, but like the subtle reality unfolding before our eyes without us noticing. I felt the truth embedded within me, and that was worse than any nightmare, because now I knew. And once you know, you can no longer pretend you didn't see. Then the scene changed. Suddenly, I was no longer flying over Toronto. I was inside a church, but it wasn't like the churches I knew. Everything was modern, minimalist, almost corporate. There were no crosses, no stained glass, no traditional symbols of faith. In place of the altar, a huge screen displayed motivational messages, beautiful words about love, prosperity, and unity, but without depth. What bothered me wasn't the words themselves, but what was missing in them. Nothing about repentance, nothing about sacrifice, nothing about the need to return to God. Only comfort, only acceptance without transformation. And then I noticed something even more frightening. Many there wore the chip. The church had not only accepted the new order, it was part of it. I observed the congregation, and for a moment, it seemed like an ordinary church. People sang, raised their hands, smiled. But then, I saw what was behind their eyes. It was the same emptiness I had seen on the streets of Toronto. It wasn't devotion. It wasn't faith. It was conformity. And the worst part, they didn't seem to notice. Technology had been integrated into the practice of faith, and there was no longer any difference between spirituality and system. The pastor, a man with an impeccable appearance, wearing a neatly tailored suit and a rehearsed smile, spoke about how God wanted his children to be connected to the future, about how submission to the new system was a necessary step for the collective good. He quoted verses, but twisted them subtly, like poison mixed in pure water, and the people drank without questioning. Then I noticed something strange. At the back of the church, near the doors, a small group watched the service without singing, without smiling. They seemed out of place, as if they were there by obligation, not by choice. But what caught my attention the most was the look of one of them, a woman with dark hair, a serious, almost distressed expression. She didn't look at the pastor, nor at the screen. She looked at the other worshippers, as if trying to see something within them, as if searching for a remnant of conscience that could still be awakened. And then, our eyes met. I didn't know how, but she saw me. For a brief moment, her face lit up in shock, as if she had sensed my presence. My heart raced. This shouldn't have been possible. But before I could understand what was happening, a shrill noise echoed through the place. The sound was high-pitched, piercing, almost unbearable. It was like an alarm, but it didn't come from any visible device. It was something deeper, more instinctive, as if it were vibrating inside me and around everything at the same time. The environment, which had once seemed so polished and artificially calm, began to change. The air grew heavy, laden with something invisible, yet oppressive. The church lights flickered for an instant, and then the entire congregation stopped. All those people, who moments before had been singing and smiling, turned their heads in unison, as if they were a single entity. Their expressions were not human. They were empty, completely devoid of emotion. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but I didn't know how. After all, was I really there? Then, the pastor stopped speaking and looked directly at me. "We have a visitor." His voice was different now. Before, it had been soft, persuasive, engaging. Now, it was cold and cutting, like broken glass dragged along the floor. My chest tightened. This was no ordinary vision. I wasn't just observing the future. In some way, I was interacting with it. And worse, what I saw could also see me. The woman at the back of the church widened her eyes, as if she knew the danger this represented. She opened her mouth, trying to say something, but was interrupted when two figures emerged from the lateral shadows of the church. They were tall, too thin to be human, with eyes as deep and dark as an endless void. They didn't walk, they glided, and every step they took left a trail of darkness, as if they were draining the very light from the surroundings. My instinct told me to run, but how? I didn't have a body there. I didn't belong to that place in the way they did, but somehow I was trapped in that vision in a way I never imagined possible. The creatures kept moving toward me, and with each step they seemed to consume more of the reality around. The lamps flickered violently until some exploded, sending sparks across the ceiling. But the worst was when they passed by the people in the congregation. There was no shock, no reaction. The worshippers just stayed there, motionless, like soulless dolls. They were accustomed to the presence of those things. They saw no problem, and that terrified me the most. The pastor smiled, not a smile of welcome or surprise, but a calculated smile, as if he had already known I would be there. "You shouldn't be seeing this, Morris," he said, and his voice echoed throughout the church. How did he know my name? How did he know I was there? My heart, or whatever I was at that moment, pounded in panic. The shadows of the creatures grew around me, enclosing me like invisible claws. For a moment, everything went dark. The light of Jesus, which had once enveloped me, now seemed distant.